Hey, and welcome to The Caption Life. And in this episode, we're going to be reviewing the Age of Apocalypse storyline from Marvel Comics back in 1995, 1996. And our special guest host is Kim Maney from the ODPH Podcast. And he shares with us where the story behind the ODPH comes from. We also talk about how much we hate the idea of being locked into a niche. And we also discuss how asking someone on a comics podcast what their comics origin story is not that original. Hi, and welcome to The Caption Life, a show for the most casual and dedicated fans of comics and a member of the Comic Watch family. I'm your host, Sean. Join me and discover what the world of comics and graphic novels have to offer. From one-on-one interviews with industry professionals, roundtable discussions with passionate fans, and reviews on the latest comics, TV shows, and movies. Now let's dive right on in. Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the show. We are doing a comics review and commentary, and today we're going to review the comic series Age of Apocalypse in 1995. That's by Marvel Comics. It was primarily a 10-issue story arc with tie-ins that ran from 95 to 96. It was created by a number of writers and artists such as Mark Waid, Scott, I think it's Lobdell is how you pronounce his name. If not, I apologize. Jeff Loeb, Andy Kubert, Tony S. Daniel, Joe Bennett, Adam Kubert, and more. There's a lot of people who are involved with this story. This comic that we're about to review was recommended by today's guest host, so please welcome to the show, Ken Maney. Ken is an executive producer and host of the ODPH or Ocho Duro Parlay Hour podcast, along with being the co-host of 607 TWS, the wrestling show podcast. He also does weekly comic book reviews for the ODPHpod and Nerd Initiative. Ken is also a freelance pro wrestling blogger and all-around fan of sports, movies, TV, comics, and pro wrestling. Ken, welcome to the show. How you doing today?
Sean, thank you so much for having me on. I'm a big Caption Life fan, so this is something I definitely have been excited to talk about, and just thank you again. I'm still amped to talk about this series with you.
And I'm glad that you suggested this because Age of Apocalypse is a title that I think any X-Men fan is always aware of. It's not one I've read before you suggested this. So this is the first time I actually sat down and read this major event that's been part of the X-Men lore, since not the beginning, obviously, but it's when you think of key events in the X-Men story, This is definitely one that's been brought up. And I mean, in fact, there is a movie with the same title. It's not the same story, but the same title. And I think, taking that inspiration there, definitely means like it has that impact on the X-Men story, which is really interesting. We'll get into that a little bit. But Ken, I got to say, I am a big fan of your show as well, too, and a big fan of a lot of things that you do. I'll be honest, I am not a wrestling fan, and I've never heard of anything wrestling related until you and I connected. And then like all of a sudden I hear about wrestling all the time, with your tweets and stuff like that. So it's really interesting to see how many people are fans of wrestling because I'm just not part of that circuit. And, it's not that I grew up like liking wrestling. It's just not been one of those things I've always been really, committed to or really in love with. But it's just really interesting to see how many people love wrestling. But what I wanted to ask you, because we were talking about this before we started recording, is your show called ODPH, Ocho Duro Parlay Hour. What is the story behind the name of that podcast?
Okay, so the story behind it is it's actually a nod to my late father. Because when we were planning out the podcast back in 2015, unfortunately, he became sick with pancreatic cancer and unfortunately lost his battle.
No, I'm sorry.
No, thank you. And when we got back on the podcast idea again, my co-host and logo designer at the time, both were kind of kicking around ideas. And of course, you go through so many weird names when you're kind of kicking around podcasts. And we were just doing the very generic ones. And then they knew my dad had this weird, uncanny ability that he could throw a hard 8 or an Ocho Duro in craps at like the most random times. And I never thought this was true until I went out to Las Vegas with him. And sure enough, like he couldn't do it like on command, but if he like could call that shot, he was like, Ken, throw in, I got this. And he nailed that thing. So much so, like we'd go into certain casinos and they yell Ocho Duro at him, like he's like Caesar walking into Rome. And I'm like literally looking around like what is going on here? And we always thought like that was just kind of like the nickname and just like good times, good thoughts, and just energy. And we thought like nobody else in podcasting is going to have this name.
Right.
So it'll definitely stand out. And we were going to talk a multiple of topics, which is a parlay bets.
Mm-hmm.
So put it all together. We were trying to keep the show around an hour. If you listen to the show nowadays, well, we try, but that doesn't
There's
happen.
hours involved. Yeah.
Yeah, there's hours involved,
Yeah.
especially if you listen to the wrestling show crossovers. But we know it's a mouthful, and that's why we just call it the ODPH.
Right. I love that backstory. Well, and I gotta say, you're just like we was talking about, like your show is definitely longer than an hour now, but you guys cover a lot of things and you cover it very well. Like I
Thank
really
you.
enjoy one, the coverage you give on each of these topics, because I feel like in each episode you cover basically like three main things usually. It's
Mm.
usually entertainment related, wrestling related, and comics related, or a combination of those things, generally speaking. But even though it's longer than an hour, it's done very well, and it has a very clear segmented part to it. So it's I think it's organized and done very well. The name is that's a fantastic story. I love hearing that story about how you came up with that name. I gotta be honest, when I hear Ocho, like I immediately think of dodgeball, like ESPN,
Yep.
the Ocho. But I love this story much better, and much better. Like my grammar's terrible. I love this story better.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
No,
It's a great
oh,
it's a great tribute to your father though. Like I think that's it's really endearing and really heartwarming to hear like those kinds of stories about how show the backstory of that just has a lot more meaning than just what you see with the name there.
yeah, it was just something that he was excited when we were talking around this, and just unfortunately life happens like in that instance, and that podcast gets put on the back burner, and it's like you switch focus to what really matters.
Hmm.
So when we decided to get back on the proverbial horse for it, it was just thinking, okay, how could we do something? And I threw the name out there, and my former co-host Josh Royce he knew my dad, and he was like, "Yes, we're doing that." And we got to find a way to incorporate it because everybody's going to be like, what is this? I'm like, simple. We shorten it up because who thinks in the sports world of Eastern Sports Programming Network? We just say ESPN.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So,
Um, and speaking of, so like a lot of podcaster, and you and I do this more as a on the side type of thing.
mm,
We don't do this for the money because we don't get paid for
yeah.
money. We do this for enjoyment and stuff like that. So I'm always curious, the person behind the microphone, outside of doing this podcast and doing, talking about the things you love, like comics and sports and entertainment and wrestling and things like that. What do you do for your full-time job? A little bit more about you as a person and things like that.
I am in management at a grocery chain.
Awesome.
Yes. So I literally do that. And just really outside of work, it's just kind of explore the fandoms, and really, I've always just been a big wrestling fan. So it's always been something to, go to. We have local wrestling here all the time. We have an independent federation called Excite Wrestling, which in a weird 7 degrees of separation, my former boss, when I was doing an internship at the radio stations locally, is now
Hmm.
the owner of that federation.
Oh, cool.
So when I go to it, I'm like, hey, and it's like, hey, buddy. And, just kind of kick around that. So it's just a matter of, at work, it's all focus and, doing the best things we can do there. But as soon as we leave, it's, outside. And honestly, the podcast just became everywhere I would go. I just wind up getting in conversations with people about the different fandoms, like whether it's sports, whether it's pro wrestling. I never try keeping it to be just, such a small niche for me, because
Right.
I love talking with everybody about anything. And it's just for some people, they're really into sports. And then some people are like, well, I'm into sports, but I don't know it that well because I'm
Yeah.
really more of a comic person. And that's like a perfect ODPH Society member because it's like, hey, we want to talk to you about whatever. And if you don't know a lot, that's cool. Like, come to the party. Like,
Yeah.
here's the door, walk right through it. And I am fortunate enough that I get to do this with the one and only Padawan Jay, who, he has really, grown in his voice over the years. And obviously, Pat is a great person to talk to on Twitter at Meslin. I'll give him a plug too. And he's a Star Wars aficionado, but he knows his sports too. So we always do that. And, we just kind of branch out and just like, it's literally just an extension of us hanging out outside of work, just doing this between us and our fam over at 3FN. I've known Rich for quite some time. And like literally it's just an expansion of what we do outside of work.
Yeah. Well, and I love how you talk about, you talk about a lot of things and it's more, just outside of a certain niche, because I think that's one of the struggles that I see with myself, but I see with other people as well too, is that with social media and podcasting and things like that, they tell you that in order to be, successful or to be heard, you have to have like a certain niche. And now it's like we're getting into, because even niches are so saturated, you have to have a niche inside a niche. And I think when we start doing that, we start losing the humanity or the human part of that person of who we are. And that I am much more than, someone who loves comics. I definitely love comics. Like I have a podcast about that, but there's so much more to you and me beyond, just the comics things. So I'm always a big advocate of trying to encourage people that just because you don't usually talk about something, if it's something that is really important or you care about, we need to open up the idea that niche should be beyond just a very specific thing that feeds into the algorithm, but this is like a, man versus machine kind of conversation I didn't want to get into, but it's more of like trying to encourage, these things to, more adapt to us rather than we adapt to the algorithm and that sort of thing. And so it's like, trying to focus more on who the person is rather than the things I talk about, because the things I talk about comes from, from us in terms of who we are as a person and everything. And that's what gives it, a lot of insights and everything. And so I love the idea of trying to get past the barriers of a niche and do more of, this is more of the things I'm interested in. It's not just one thing, but it's multiple things, but it's all, part of who I am basically. So I love that idea. And I think we need to do more of that. Even though, our podcast tends to have a focus on a particular topic, we definitely need to be open to the fact that people want to talk about more than just those things. I've said this on the show multiple times, like I'm an adopted father, and those are stories that I tell all the time about what it means to be an adoptive father in certain circumstances and certain things that even within my fandoms, like there are times where I see adoption being handled in the MCU or Star Wars and how they have those conversations, especially with the conversation with Loki, right? And how he's adopted and all that. I remember talking about how that has been kind of handled in the MCU from, the first Thor movie to where we're at now with, the Loki season and everything. And so even though I kind of made that topic relevant because of my niche, it's still more of, I'm an adoptive father. I want to, shed this light about, what it means to be an adoptive father, not just with the MCU that I usually talk about, but just anything in general that might impact that. So I agree with you. And I think that we need to be doing more as content creators, kind of, busting out that door of niche should not be defining us, but we should, tell it that this is just part of the bigger, larger soul of who we are. So
no, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's something that I've seen now. We've been fortunate enough to do the ODPH going on 6 years in a couple months. And now it's always a thing that I always trying to preach to everybody that's a new podcaster or a new content creator. It's like, don't be afraid to expose the different areas of yourself, but, really be somebody that's comfortable talking about it. Like if you're somebody that's into pro wrestling and you're into some movies, like it's cool to talk about both. You don't have to do it just for a certain market. Always open the door to just have that conversation, and it can work if you do it right. Like if your content is good, I will always preach this first and foremost. If your content is good, people will find it, right? Because people will gravitate towards being a genuine conversation and being around people that have that honest opinions. And I said, people will find it word of mouth. I mean, that's the biggest thing you can do. So if you try doing things for clicks or doing things because it's the cool thing now, it's not going to get you long term. It'll be short term, here today, gone today. I mean, that's just how the algorithms are. So the more that you just be yourself and just go for it and, take the shot. We it's a weird thing I always kind of keep in the back of my head, but it's like we all have a start date. We all have an end date. It's how you fill in the middle of the story. That's what counts.
Exactly. I agree 100%. I love that. Well, thank you for sharing that. And one of the things I do with our guest hosts, and I ask them, well, let me take a step back. I usually ask them, the same question. And I got to tell you a little history of this, is that this question is usually, what's your comic book origin story? And I remember when I came up with this question, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's such a great question to ask people, because comic books always have this, this relationship with characters that have origin stories. So I'm like, oh, that'd be so good to incorporate in that show. Well, since then, I came up with that question. I've listened to so many comic podcasts that has the same question that they asked their guests. I'm like, okay, apparently that's not original, right? Like everybody asks what their comic book origin story is or some variation of it. So what I've been doing a little bit different lately is it's still origin story, but I like to connect it to the comic that we're going to review. So what I'm going to ask you is, what is your origin story with X-Men or Age of Apocalypse, whether it's the story itself or just, X-Men in general? How did you get connected with that character in that property, whether it's through comics or through some other medium? What was your origin story with how you got connected with the X-Men?
It's funny how you bring it up because this actually connects to my nerd origin story.
That's awesome.
Because when I was growing up in preschool, kindergarten, when it was arts and crafts day, our teacher would bring in the comics section from the newspapers. Like they would purposely save it. And I would be reading the Spider-Man news strip they used to put in the comics at my table. And they'd be like, well, like, what are you doing? And I'd be like, well, I'm reading the story to everybody. And my parents heard about this and they were like, oh, that's awesome. Like he's into reading. And my grandmother, God rest her soul, was like, there's a comic book shop that's about 6 blocks away from the school. Do you want to go?
Oh my gosh. Your grandmother said this?
Yeah. So
that is amazing.
So her and my great uncle would throw in some money so I could go to the shop.
Yeah.
And I walked in the door, and the first thing I see is Spider-Man, X-Men, Fantastic Four, all on the line. I think I walk into like Nirvana. Like I'm like, what is this magical place, and why have I not been here before?
Right.
So from there, I became a Marvel-centric fan. It was nothing against DC. Like I knew about Super Friends on the cartoon, but I was always like, after that moment, I was like, Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends. And I remember seeing the one X-Men's cartoon where Wolverine has like the worst accent ever, and he's being thrown by the Juggernaut, and he's going like straight at the camera, and then he comes flying back. Like, it's one of the craziest things, but it's the Juggernaut is what he does. And I just remember I was like, okay, that's kind of cool, but it's not with Spider-Man, blah, blah, blah. And then, but I was always a fan because of Iceman too. And then right around like a couple of years later, this is when they were bringing X Factor back as in the original X-Men lineup. And they found Jean Grey wherever she crashed after the Dark Phoenix saga. I mean, obviously I would say when she died, but I mean, obviously we lose track at this point of how many times it happened. But when X Factor rolled out, I started reading it and I was like, this is my book. Like I just gravitated towards that original lineup. And especially when they went to Archangel and Apocalypse, I'm like, this is awesome. And like, I just started just freaking out. So that's how I got involved in the X universe. Cause I always thought like the X-Men were cool, but I was just really not impressed with them. But then obviously it's kind of the gateway into the whole X-verse because obviously everything is all connected, kind of a precursor to the MCU, because when you have to read crossovers, you got to read every single book known to man. And that's how I kind of got exposed to the X-Men universe. And then obviously Jim Lee came along and the rest was comic history.
That's amazing. I love that story.
Yeah. So that's literally, I became just a big Marvel fan. I mean, and then I got into DC a little later, but that's for another time.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's funny because I know a lot of people have said on the show in terms of what got them, starting comics in general has been a number of things. The number one response I always get is either the X-Men animated series or the Batman animated series, right? Like that was kind of like the gateway drug into comics for a lot of people as they saw the cartoon series, so they want to get into comics. But I love the fact, I think you're probably the first guest I've had where they said that their grandmother told them about the local comic shop. I don't think my grandparents really even knew what comics were because, well, I take that back. My grandparents on my mom's side did because my uncle was a huge comic fan when he was growing up. He was the one that introduced me to that. But I don't think they really knew much about comic shops. I think they just knew that my uncle loved comics and that was it. So like looking at my own grandparents, I don't think they would be able to tell you where a comic shop was in the city that we live in. So the fact that your grandmother not only knew what they were, but could tell you like where one was located at, I absolutely love that story. I think that's so great that hearing more of stories like that is phenomenal. So that's great.
Yeah, no, it was crazy because like, yeah, she brought it up and my dad was like, oh yeah, I know about that place too. And like, and he started getting into comics later with me too.
Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah. Which was kind of the weird thing because he never was like when I was growing up, he was always into baseball cards and I was just comics. And then one day he was just like, let me go to the shop with you. Let me go check this out.
Oh, that's
and
so
like,
cool.
Yeah. Like, and he was ironically a big Nightwing fan. Really big about
kidding.
Dick Grayson. Yeah. Really big about Dick Grayson. So yeah, it was just kind of is an awesome bonding experience. So that my family's always just been super supportive of that.
Oh, that's so awesome. See, and my dad, I love my dad, and he's he's my personal hero. But when it comes to things like this, like it's not something that he's ever been interested in. His interests have been auto mechanics. Like he is a mechanic by trade. He's the smartest person I know when it comes to cars is him. And so his thing has always been mechanics, World War II history, sports, especially baseball. He's just a history buff in general. So like those are his things. But when it comes to things like this, like it's not his, foray by any means whatsoever. But at the same time, like we bonded over other things. And so it's not an experience that he and I have had necessarily like growing up, but he always loves like how excited I got by it. He always, loves when I went to a comic shop and I got a comic. He was really excited about that, or like video games and stuff like that. So he was supportive and love how excited I got by those things. It's just not something that he ever like personally got invested in it by any means whatsoever. So talking about the X-Men, then let's dive into Age of Apocalypse. Let me ask you, why did you wanted for us to do a review of this story arc specifically? I know you talked a little bit about that in your X-Men origin story a little bit, but why, when I asked you which comic do you want to review for the show, why did you gravitate to Age of Apocalypse here?
Reasons, actually. So one, at the time when you asked me about coming on the show and talking books, Image Comics announced a return of a series that I literally lost my mind was coming back. And that's Battle Chasers, which is coming out June 14th.
That's right. Yeah. I remember you were really excited about that.
Yeah, because that's Joey Mad art. And I always remember first reading his artwork in the Uncanny X-Men and then what was Astonishing X-Men for the Age of Apocalypse run, and how much I love that series.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously when he left the X-Men line to go form Cliffhanger with J. Scott Campbell and Humberto Ramos, and they were doing the subprint for Wildstorm, Battle Chasers was one of the books there. And then, it just kind of, that's a whole different story.
Right.
But the fact that the book was back, I literally dropped my phone when I got this news because I was like, this has to be like, this is not real.
Yeah.
Trust me, I will be talking about that when that book drops. So that was reason number one. Reason number two is one book series that you've been reading is The Sins of Sinister.
Mm-hmm.
And same here. And if you notice anything with the Jonathan Hickman universe that he's done, he's kind of paid a little homage to certain X-Men stories throughout the years.
Mm-hmm.
Sins of Sinister is the homage to Age of Apocalypse.
Yeah, I was about to say, reading this, I saw a lot of parallels with that. Like it was just, I felt like I was not to a T, but I felt like I was reading the same story over again with a lot of elements that they had in there. So yeah, I agree completely. It was very much an homage to Age of Apocalypse with what they're doing with the current X-Men run, especially Sin of Sinister and everything with the Krakoan age that they have. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I was like, this is a perfect book to talk about because I have not dived into the series in quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And man, the memories that came back with this thing. Oh,
right. I'm sorry, did you say 3 or two?
2.
Oh, 2. Okay. I thought you said 3. So I didn't want to cut
I'm
you
pretty
off
sure I
there.
did.
You probably did. I honestly I have hearing loss, so it's probably me.
Okay.
Yeah. So
or I'll just say and 3, because I super want to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, those are great reasons, and I think we're going to really dive into a lot of those things, especially point number 2. Just like we talked about, there's a lot of parallels with what's going on now with the X-Men stories that I think we'll dive into a lot. So before we get started with summarizing what the story is about, This is a spoiler warning for everybody who is watching or listening. We're going to definitely spoil what's in the series, which, by the way, came out, almost 30 years ago. So if you haven't read it by then, it's not necessarily a spoiler at this point. But if you are wanting to read it in the future, definitely put this on pause and then come back to this when you've read it or when you're ready to listen to this. So now that's been said, that's your spoiler warning. So let's go ahead and dive into a synopsis of what the story is about. So this is, as I mentioned before, this is a 10-issue story arc from various series, which is really interesting because usually with a lot of story events, it's usually centered around a particular, comic series or something like that. But this one, as you had mentioned, is, dives in from, it originally originates with two series. That's like the story of the Quest of Legion, basically.
Yeah.
It kind of sets up the Age of Apocalypse story run. And it goes back and forth between, I think, the Uncanny X-Men and I forget what the other one is.
Just a regular X-Men.
Oh, and just regular X-Men. Yeah. So you go like X-Men number 40, and then Uncanny X-Men like number 320 or something like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you get those 4 issues, and then you read X-Men Alpha, and then 4 issues of Astonishing X-Men, and then you read X-Men Omega. And so it's kind of all over the place in terms of how you follow it. And then not only to throw that sort of confusion in there, but there's a lot of tie-ins that kind of feeds into the story as well, which is why it's very similar to what we're reading right now with the current X-Men runs with Immortal X-Men, Sins of Sinister Age, or whatever they're calling it, but all the series they have coming out. There's a lot of tie-ins that if you're not reading all of them, you can kind of get lost in some of the stories because you're kind of like, where is this coming from? Like, I don't remember this being part of the story with the other issues I've read. And it's because like it was covered in a different X-Men series, basically. And so this is kind of really reminiscent of that. Is as I'm reading through it, again, there's a lot of tie-ins to this. As you mentioned, there's, I think, 6 or 8 other series that really is connected to this main event. I only read the 10 issues as central to this. So as I'm reading this personally, there's a lot of questions that I have that I'm like, did I miss something here? Did I, not read this before? And turns out like, no, I didn't read before because this was actually mentioned in a different series that I haven't read yet. So that's kind of the limiting thing here. But it starts off with the 4 series or the 4 issue series, Legion of Quest, between the X-Men and Uncanny X-Men series. And basically it sets up Age of Apocalypse in that we find out David Haller, who was the son of Gabrielle Haller and Charles Xavier, is originally someone that has dissociative identity disorder. And then I guess at some point that it kind of went away, or he somehow became more unified or one. And now each of these personalities or identities used to have like their own special power. But now that he's kind of had under control, he's under like one identity, he has all those powers and more. And what he's decided to do is he wants to honor his father by going back in time and killing Magneto, because Magneto's always stopped him from achieving his dream, right? Like that's pretty much what Legion Quest is. And yeah, so that's the start of it. Ken, do you want to like kind of chime in what else happens in this Legion of Quest before we get into Age of Apocalypse as well?
Yeah, sure. So Legion Quest was just the setup for this and really showing, Legion has always been a very complex entity in the X universe.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he decides to do this to take out Magneto, he doesn't realize what he's doing because there's a lot of time travel involved. A lot of things get really crazy. And what Marvel did for this time too is they shut down their entire X-Men line and converted it over to the Age of Apocalypse. So every single book that was on the line was in the Age of Apocalypse universe, which just makes it for an insane read.
Right.
But that's why I say, like, so you really got to pick and choose your stories that you read. And like, we'll get into it as we do a deeper dive. But Legion Quest was the spot that kicked everything off. And there's so many moments that happen before the final issue of Legion Quest that if you've been reading the X-Men line, there's big consequences that happen when they come back out of this.
Right.
That you might not realize, because there's the amazing Wolverine and Sabretooth fight by Adam Kubert, I think it was Adam Kubert in the regular series, and is one of the most vicious fights you'll ever see in all of comics, and especially how it ends. And then you have the first time that Rogue and Gambit kiss, and she absorbs him.
Yes.
And what happens after is absolutely crazy. Right before the MCON crystal takes over and the time changes and all that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And there's a lot, just like you said, that goes on into just this 4-series event before Age of Apocalypse happens, right? So when David goes back into in time, Charles Xavier gets visited by some sort of alien empire, that somebody he knows who apparently was in love with Xavier as well too. Which, by the way, apparently a lot of women pine over Charles Xavier, which I did not realize. You know, I know there's a few out there, but then reading this one, I'm like, how many women are in love with Charles Xavier? Seems like a lot of them are. And so, you know, they show up to try to make sure that reality doesn't break as they know it. There's a couple weird parts in there, and what happens is, as I said, David goes back to where Magneto and Xavier are at the height of their friendship. But what's interesting is that when they go back in time, he drags along with him a few X-Men: Storm, Iceman, Bishop, and Psylocke. Yeah. But when they go back, like, none of them remember who they are. So it takes them, I think, months before they figure out who they are, what they're doing there, including David Haller, because David, aka Legion, wasn't quite sure why he is there until finally he made some sort of contact with Magneto, and then everything comes back, flooding back to him. But there's some other bizarre stuff that happened as well too. So David Haller, if you don't know his power, he can do a lot of things, but one of the things he can do is kind of manipulate reality as people see it. So there is this one scene in Legion Quest where he's approaching his mother, and I forget why he's doing this. I think he's trying to set up a trap or something like that.
Yes.
But when he approaches his mother, he appears to her as Charles Xavier, and then that whole story folds out to where David Haller as Xavier is like putting the moves on his mother to try to get her to, like, you know, go unconscious, stuff like that. And it was a really weird moment, which I'm just like, it's weird. It's also 90s, so it's not that weird, because weird stuff happened that people weren't like really, they're like, oh, that's more interesting at that time. And now we're just like, why would you even come up with that idea? It was odd, to say the least. Yeah.
As we say on the ODPH, reasons.
Yeah, for reasons. Yeah. So it was just, I remember that being really odd, but the way it ended is that David was about to kill Magneto when Xavier steps in to save him, and inadvertently David kills Xavier, which means that instead of killing Magneto to try to change the future for a better world, he ends up erasing everything that they know about the current state of the X-Men in present day, which means that Xavier, you know, no longer is around during present time, because this was like 20 years in the past, basically. There's no X-Men in terms of, you know, being led by Xavier, right? So David Haller is no longer alive in present day. Everything changes, basically, which goes into Age of Apocalypse. So when we start Age of Apocalypse, we start with X-Men Alpha, and we find out that Magneto actually ends up being a good guy, because the fact that Xavier saved his life made him have a change of heart in terms of, I don't want to say change of heart, because at that time he was still kind of struggling a little bit. Like, he, I think, was still kind of questioning, you know, if humans and mutants can still live together at that time when that event happened. And so it's not so much a change of heart, but it kind of solidified that because his friend sacrificed his life, that he wanted to continue the good work that his friend did, and, you know, didn't want to make his life go to waste because of that. But Magneto looks very different. He has very long white hair. He is the leader of the X-Men, so they're still an X-Men, but it's because he named the team after his great friend instead of, you know, it being named, you know, the M-Men or whatever, Magneto or whatnot. But the X-Men are very different than what we have. So we have Sabretooth as part of that lineup, right? Nightcrawler's in there, but Nightcrawler has like a different look to him. Him and Magneto and Rogue are married in this storyline.
Yep.
Which I found interesting. And I gotta be honest, like, I get the appeal to a lot of people of like Rogue being like a really strong romantic, you know, interest for a lot of people. Like, it's just not me. Like, Rogue is not someone in the comics that I find a lot of romantic interest in. So it really is just fascinating to me how Rogue always seems to be centered around a lot of people's like attention and affection in the story.
Well, you know, what the crazy thing is, they were playing on a lot of fandoms that they had kind of teased a little bit throughout the years, because there was the moments when Rogue was in the shadow, or Savage Land, with Magneto. So
Yeah.
they went back there, and obviously they answered with Wolverine, Jean, and Cyclops, and they went a different direction for that. They were playing a lot of fan service, in my opinion, to these ideas that everybody's kind of teased, but like, will they, won't they? They said, okay, let's give it a shot and see how it plays out.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really fascinating. Like, I will say this is that it definitely seems Rogue and Magneto all the way through this story arc were like really a fascinating, great couple, you know, and the fact that it's got to be really infuriating for Gambit Rogue stands, because Rogue and Magneto were able to figure out a way for Magneto to use his power to stop Rogue's power from like absorbing him whenever they touch. So it's one of those things. It's like, oh, you want Rogue to have that, but you also want her to be with Gambit because that's like their soulmates and everything. But yeah, just like everything that you know about the X-Men lore like changed. But when they got to this point, basically, and this is something you can probably fill in with me, is that Apocalypse is pretty much taking over the entire world. So Magneto and the X-Men are trying to stop Apocalypse from, you know, decimating all of mankind, which again is a change from what we know about Magneto, because Magneto is okay with wiping off mankind from the face of the earth, but now he's trying to save them from Apocalypse here. And so that's kind of where the story, kind of kicks off, is that we get to see this new lineup. Sabretooth, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but Sabretooth is part of the lineup now. And it's really interesting because I love his story with Blink, who I never really read much of Blink in the comics, if at all. So this is kind of the first time I've read the character, and I really love the story between Sabretooth and Blink, because Sabretooth was pretty much the person that brought her up, like saved her as she was a kid and brought her up, and was kind of that father figure for her. And so that really serves as a strong point of story in this entire event of Age of Apocalypse, because that kind of serves to a lot of motivation for Sabretooth as well as Blink for what they do later on in the story as well. So, but yeah, so that was X-Men Alpha. Then we get into the Astonishing X-Men, where it's all the Age of Apocalypse story parts. To kind of do a long story short, I gotta say this is that for an event that's called Age of Apocalypse, Apocalypse is not in this 10-issue arc hardly at all. He's in, I think, issue number 4 of Astonishing X-Men, and then the X-Men Omega, which is the final issue of this event. And like, that's it. He's talked about, but he doesn't really appear in any of the issues. So for an event to be called Age of Apocalypse and he's not very present, like really throws me off a little bit. I'm sure you could probably attest to this, Ken. Like if you read the tie-ins, he probably shows up a lot there. It probably makes a lot more sense. But like for this being the core central story, I'm like, it should have been called, the showdown between Holocaust, who's like a mutant that's fighting Sabretooth, right? Holocaust and the X-Men, something like that. Because like the majority of that arc was Holocaust trying to stop the X-Men from getting to Apocalypse in this story.
Well, the big thing with him is I thought they did something really well with him, is they sprinkled him throughout these series, and it wasn't anything that he was too overpowering. Like he's more featured in Factor X, which took over for X Factor at the time, but is you just kind of have him being the overall looming figure, and they decided to just let these sub characters run crazy. And that's why I say, if you're going to read one series out of this entire bunch, it's Astonishing X-Men by Scott Lobdell and Joey Mad. Right. Like that pretty much can sum up everything you need. But if you deep dive into the other series, like, yeah, you can see his fingerprints are all throughout this, because when they get to X-Men Omega, by the time you get there, and you got to remember, these books were coming out monthly. By the time you get there, the build is almost set up in a pro wrestling stance that you're finally at that moment where it's like you're going to have that showdown. And then it's like, okay, you finally get that confrontation. The payoff is just that big because they haven't had that confrontation yet. Right. Because I think if they showed up and they showed what he could do at the first issue, it would have really defeated the purpose. But you have to have him making the X-Men family life a living hell. That when they finally get that moment to come back, you're sitting there and just going, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and just as you mentioned, a lot of things had changed at the beginning of it. So one of the things we talked about is Jean Grey and Logan were actually a romantic couple. And we saw that, I think, in the first issue, either of X-Men Alpha or first issue of Astonishing X-Men.
Alpha.
Is it Alpha? Okay, gotcha. Yep. Yeah. And so, Scott Summers is not even, on the same team as they are. And then when you get into X-Men Omega, like this is a part that threw me for a loop. It's like you see, just as you mentioned, all the stories kind of coming in together, because this is a X-Men Alpha and X-Men Omega was a double issue basically, because it was like a 44-page special event. But you could tell all the stories were coming together, because then you saw all the characters that were not in Astonishing X-Men that made their appearance here. And what happened in X-Men Omega is that you saw Scott and Jean like back together. And I remember thinking like, well, what the hell happened here? Like, I don't know. I don't remember any of this happening in the previous issues, but just like you said, it's like all becomes, and it's very reminiscent of like what we're talking about with the current run of Sinister, because I remember Immortal X-Men was kind of this way where it's kind of the central story of the Krakoan age of what we're getting now, where there's a lot of tie-ins to X-Men stories that gives you a lot more details of what's going on. But if you read the Immortal X-Men, kind of gives you that overview of what's happening in the story. And I feel like that's what happened here with X-Men Alpha, Omega, and the Astonishing X-Men, is that it gives you the overview, like what's happening in the main story. So it's really fascinating. I think, that's been kind of the challenge here with these X-Men tie-ins, is that there's so many going on that if you're trying to read just one storyline, you feel, at least for me, I feel like as a fan, I couldn't really enjoy it unless I read some of these other issues, because there's so many details I felt like that they mention it, but then you kind of get sign blinded by them because your understanding was very different than what had happened in this issue. And I think it's just this is a reflection of kind of a pressing issue what's happening with these tie-ins now, is that a lot of people feel like they're lost and feel like it's very overwhelming to try to get into the X-Men series, because that's pretty much how they set it up now, is that if you want to enjoy the X-Men, it's no longer a single series you can read. It's these multi-series that if you want to understand everything that's going on, you have to like invest a lot of money, a lot of time just on this one team up. And this is very much an example of that. And I feel like this is probably like at the beginning of it, like what you talked about, this is very much a 90s X-Men event, is, this is how they do things. And like now it's just getting a little bit more expounded in that regard. And that it just gets overwhelming for somebody who wants to get right back into it. So I think overall with this story, it is a kind of a difficult one to follow through if you're not reading the other ones. But the writing is really good. The artwork I thought was really fascinating, because when you look at the cover, it's like it's very unique and just really grabs your attention for some reason. I don't know what it is. I think it's like a mixture of colors and the artwork and all that. But I know for me, one of the things that really stand out is as I'm reading these issues, anytime you see anyone that's like in the shadows, their face is always in the shadow, but you see their eyes and their teeth very, very clearly. And it just really sticks out as like an artistic way to be able to show that they're in the, they're in the dark, supposed to be scared, but then you really see their face that, they are scared or something astonishing is happening, pun intended there. But, yeah, but like it's a really interesting artwork concept, because I don't think I've seen that before, after, since then. And it's probably, very much the style of that artist there. But so this story overall, I thought was just really fascinating. And they try to take down Apocalypse, and so eventually what they do is they find Bishop, and Bishop wasn't quite sure like what was happening until again he got his memories back, and then they sent him back to stop David from changing the future. So it's almost like the Days of Future Past kind of thing happening, where they send somebody back to stop the future from happening, and so that's exactly what happens. And then it's kind of interesting because the way that X-Men Omega ends is you see everything kind of in that reality just pretty much goes away, and everybody knows like it's for the greater good, but they're also kind of still unsure about the whole thing as well too. So
it's an interesting ending of what they do, because like I say, and you touched upon it right on the head. This has always been something that if you talk to X-Men fans, either you are all in and you buy every single book a month, or it's tough to get into crossovers because you literally have to buy every series. And this has been something they've done since the 90s and then some, because fans were really in tune for this. And especially with like Age of Apocalypse, you can get the bookends, which is Alpha and Omega, and you'll get the story, but you won't get like the real emotion that's been building for it. Because a lot of fans will tune in and they'll go like, oh, well, why is Havoc doing this to Scott? Like they're supposed to be friends, but unless you read Factor X, you don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And then so when that whole moment's happening, you're going like, wait, what is going on here? But that's how they get you to go buy all those issues. And I mean, it's smart in one aspect, but I think it's something that will really take you out from being a fan. Like for me, I read them all at the time. And
Right.
that's why, like, when I walked in that final issue, like I was super excited for Magneto versus Apocalypse and the throwdown they have there.
Right.
Because, like I say, much like in the sense of a wrestling build, they had really had very little interaction beforehand, but now it's like the gloves are off. This is the end. And in the one sense, too, is everybody knows that they're relying on the hope that Bishop is right with his visions.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he's not, this is all for nothing, and they're literally going to end the world because of somebody's bad dream.
Yes.
But they're willing to take the shot with it because what they're living through right now with Apocalypse, they don't want to do another day with.
Right.
And I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a testament to like what's going on and just what Xavier's dream just influenced Magneto at the time. He's like, he threw his life in front of mine to save me.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm going to honor his legacy and I'm going to fulfill his dream. And then he comes around to it at the end. So by the time that, now it's like you see that final page where it's just everything's changing, you get that sense that like now he finally gets it.
Right. Oh yeah. Well, and there's a lot of character development with that as well too, right? So, for example, I find it really interesting that in this world, Quicksilver is still around, and so Magneto obviously, had a different wife before Rogue, and that Quicksilver still calls Rogue mother, I think, and like out of respect, but she's not his mother by any means. But Magneto and Rogue has a child and named him Charles after Charles Xavier. And I forget which issue it was, but while all this is happening, Magneto is at the Xavier mansion. That's, one of their secret hideouts, but has been destroyed for years. But he's just holding his son and just, you really get to see that panel of showing parental love for a child where, he just knows he says something to the effect that, a child is love, as a whole, basically. And so he just spends that night wanting to just hold his child, while he sleeps and just, just be with him and just feel that love of his son and, just for, love in general, just, that whole feeling of being able to just, cherish that before he knows the inevitable is going to happen. And so I think, just like you said, like once he gets to that point, he kind of sees, even though what he's doing with sending Bishop back might mean that he never has that reality of being in a marriage with Rogue and having that son and having that love for a child, for Charles. He's essentially giving that up because he knows that the future in their current reality is much worse than what could be happening if they send, Bishop back and all else fails. It's like, what else do they have to lose because they don't want to, just as you said, they don't want to, live another moment with that. So, I will say one of the things that was really, threw me off is that my hometown, Indianapolis, is actually in this comic run. So anytime I see Indianapolis mentioned in a comic, I was like, oh, I'm hooked because I want to see, how my hometown might be part of this whole story. And of course, like it was just very much just oh, we're in Indianapolis. And they kind of like knock, Indianapolis a little bit. It's like, of all the places they could have gone, they went to this city. I'm like, I get it. Like, it's not Chicago by any means, but, I always feel like Indianapolis never gets a fair chance from entertainment and all that. But, it was really cool. I will say that I find it weird because I think they said, the location of Apocalypse, I forget what it was, but they found the secret location for where Apocalypse was storing stuff was like 20 miles north of Indianapolis, but somehow in the next issue, they were still trying to get to Chicago. And I'm like, Chicago is definitely more than 20 miles north of Indianapolis. And so that kind of threw me off a little bit, but so that is X-Men Age of Apocalypse. Any last thoughts before we kind of do more of like what our favorite moments were and things like that? Like anything that I may have not mentioned that might be critical to the story for our listeners to really know as we start talking about these things?
Well, I mean, the easiest kind of breakdown is just thinking of, they really took some creative ideas and for the fandom and really blew it up on such a large scale. Like we
Right.
always wondered about Cable, like how would he be if he was perfectly healthy and didn't have the techno-organic virus in him? Well, you have that with X-Man, Nate Gray, and
Mm-hmm.
see how his story is, but obviously flipped a little different with Forge being his mentor instead of Rachel Summers in the future. And then you have the New Mutants, or at the time Generation X, and how they were Generation Next, and how that story completely goes off the rails of anything you've seen
Mm-hmm.
involving the New Mutants, and that is saying a lot. And
Right.
then just the deal with the Summers brothers, and seeing how Scott, who was the ultimate soldier for Charles Xavier, is now that for Apocalypse
Mm-hmm.
because of the fallout with Jean Grey, where he loses one eye and Wolverine loses a hand
Yeah.
too, which just in their ultimate showdown they had, where he loses and now he completely goes to the side of Apocalypse. Yet he has to worry about. I will say this: I thought it was one of the better writings of Alex Summers I've seen at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That he was the petty, jaded brother, and it reminded me. I know I throw a lot of wrestling references here. It was like Bret Hart and Owen Hart. Like that's kind of what it reminded me of. Just like the sibling rivalry at that time was just like really, building on just how Havoc wanted to be everything Scott was and he could never be. Like it's kind
Mm-hmm.
of how I always compare Ben Riley, I guess, to Peter Parker. That's a better comic analogy because I think Ben Riley is a lot better of a character if he's somebody that just really hates Peter Parker because he's everything he can't be. So
Right.
when you have all those factors thrown in together, it really made for an interesting, overall story, just playing up to the fandoms and really giving fans just something so creative. And coming out of that time period where you had the X-Men Renaissance with X-Men 1 and X-Force #1 with Rob Liefeld, and just how everybody kicked into new gear. And then all of a sudden the big seven went to Image. And then
Right.
it was like, what are we going to do now? And they did a great, crossover with the Executioner song, which I really loved the beginning and the end, but the middle, a lot to be desired, my opinion. But the ending's
Yeah.
fantastic. But they
Yeah.
built off this where they just said, you know what, let's just go have some fun. And I love when Marvel decides to do that. I think nowadays is a little more tougher, but I think back then it's when they just really want to be the house of ideas,
Yeah.
and just say, run with a crazy idea and go with it.
Yeah.
And this played right into it, gave fans and a lot to talk about in
Mm-hmm.
certain fandoms that we've always kind of been like, well, what if they did? What if they didn't? And sure enough, like this had such a big payoff. Like it's one of my favorite X-Men stories of all time, one of my favorite Marvel stories of all time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it gets what's interesting about this is that this is, an alternate reality that is, part of lore, but it's not something that you have to worry about being canonically correct in things.
Mm,
And I think that's what makes this story really interesting is just like what you said, they just took a bunch of wild ideas and threw it out there and made it a thing. And I think overall it sounds like it's very successful. There's a lot of stories and a lot of details that kind of goes into this, but I think that's what people like to see is that it's almost like the what if version
mm,
of X-Men in terms of, what if things were played a little bit differently in this regard. And kind of like, it's not to the same extent as Flashpoint in DC, but with Flashpoint and how the Flash goes back and changes time, stuff like that. It's kind of that same idea is that, that butterfly effect of one thing got changed. And then all of a sudden, you get this cascading effect of everything that you knew about the universe that you're reading about has changed as well. And so by the end of it goes back and pretty much returns to normal as much as I know about. I know you said like there's some things that changes. But yeah, so it's really fascinating to say the least. So it's something that if you're interested in reading Age of Apocalypse, it's definitely a whole event that's much more than these 10 issues that we touched on.
mm.
So if you have Marvel Unlimited, if you do a search of Age of Apocalypse like 1995, it'll give you a whole list of all the comics that you can read that's tied into it. Or I think there's an omnibus that you can probably get as well too if you want to get the physical copy. It'll cover all those things. But there's definitely a lot more of the richer stories that you can get that plays a lot of details into the main event that we touched on in this episode, but it definitely has a lot of these side stories that you might be interested in reading about and kind of learning more about the different kind of relationships as a result of this event that happened with or the Legion Quest. So before we get into our specific things that we liked about this story event, I want to share what people have said that what they thought about the series. And by the way, I apologize that the explanation of this story was very long. Kind of give you a backstory. I went to C2E2 last weekend, which was a lot of fun. But then when I came back, I had strep. So I've been sick all week. So I didn't even get to read the story until like 2 days ago, like starting on 2 days ago. And then I didn't even finish the last issue until probably like a couple hours before we started recording. So my mind's kind of like all over the place and trying to remember what details were important to make sure that we capture what these essential parts of the story was. So if I butchered it, I apologize because I've been kind of all over the place this week. So with that being said, I do want to share very quickly what people have said, what their thoughts were about the series. And it's really fascinating because when I first pitched this over to Comic Watch, I got a lot of response from people, not just, the number of responses, but also very lengthy responses of the thoughts about the series. I've never had that happen on an episode on any story before. Yeah. So it's really fascinating. So these are going to be a little bit longer. So I'm going to kind of go through them quickly, but it's really fascinating. I think they're really, obviously a lot of people have a lot of thoughts and a lot of feelings about this story. So let me go ahead and start off with Comic Watch. Theron Couch said one of the best written comic events, period. Except for perhaps X Universe, there isn't an ounce of fat of the story. The story is very tight and very logical in how it proceeds. The creators put thought into how Xavier's death would change the world and thus its people, as opposed to, say, Flashpoint, which just threw spaghetti against the wall. The art was next level across the board, except for perhaps Excalibur. Astonishing is practically a preview of Joe Mad's eventual manga-esque style. Generation Next is Bacalo on steroids. X-Men remains among my favorite of Scrose's work in the form of Nate Gray, McCoy, and Sugarman. It had significant impact on 616. Perhaps most impressively, we get to know most of the main characters in Age of Apocalypse better in 4 issues than we do in some 616 characters over the years. None of them are simple placeholders in a plot. They're compelling in their own right. It's still a gold standard that I measured every comic book event against. Very positive, very glowing review from Theron. I say this because then we get a comment from Gabriel DeJesus, which, to kind of give you a backstory between me and Gabriel, like, it's very fascinating because he and I always have different outlooks on movies and comics. Like, I'll like something he wouldn't. He would like something I wouldn't. So we're all very opposite. So whenever we agree on something, we're always like, is this the end of the world? And there was one day where, like, we found out we agreed on like 3 things. So we're just like, okay, the world is definitely ending because this never happened. So Gabriel actually said, essentially, find it overrated and rooted in nostalgia. I'm a sucker for continuity, so I do enjoy that it leans on it and twists it. But despite how some titles make for good reads, I find it empty when placed in a greater frame, or at least empty compared to the hype it gets. And that goes back to how I am a sucker for continuity. Yes, we got Dark Beast and Nate, who vanishes for years at a time, and Sugar Man, who vanishes for longer, but for something that is supposed to be so iconic, is so essentially, what did it do? I feel like its only imprint is when it's an anniversary and they get to, they want to reference it. It's a good read mostly, especially with Gambit Externals and Generation Next. It's fairly skippable in terms of the greater story of the Marvel Universe. Now, I know you love this story, so I'm kind of curious to see what your thoughts were with Gabriel. And to be fair, Gabriel did not read this when it came out. So he and I have very different experiences with this story. And I feel like he and I probably are similar in this regard because I enjoyed the story, but I feel like there's a lot of things I kind of wrestled with. But you read it as it was coming out, so you had a very different experience. And he even said that as somebody who didn't read it as it came out, it's a very different experience in that regard. So I'm kind of curious to see what you thought about his comment with that.
No, I think he has a very valid point too, because it's a moment in time for fans of that era. And for really anybody that was reading the X-Men run in the 90s, like, it stands out. It's almost like saying, how does Days of Future Past, the comic, impact today?
Right.
It's one of those moments that, does it hold up? Not really. And you do make a great point there about they only bring it up when it's anniversary time, because you do see, like, there has been a sequel to it, but I couldn't pick it up because, for me, you're not going to recapture the magic that was with this, because for its time, it's exceptional. And it does what it played into just really having some great ideas and trying to go with it. Reading it now, you're going to say, okay, well, what's the big deal? And honestly, the last one standing out of it is Dark Beast, who is still lurking in Krakoa, but like everybody else is pretty much non-existent.
Right.
I mean, I wish they would go back and maybe bring somebody in there to the Krakoan universe just for reasons. But we don't do that. Would just be amazing if somebody did that. So Marvel, make it happen. But I can completely understand that point. But it's just also like the argument of, do you go to the stories because if you're somebody that's all about continuum, that's fine. But are you somebody that really goes for events? Because this one, as you saw, is getting paid homage right now, how many years later?
Right.
And like that's the impact. Like when I think of like events in comics, that's what I think. Because if you see that effect still being replicated, and we've seen it in a couple of different stories too for other companies, this is one of those moments that it stands out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's been brought back like at least once that I've seen where they've done a Age Apocalypse story again. So, but yeah, it definitely has a huge impact on X-Men lore and things like that. I think, but I agree with Gabriel's point in that because it's something that was, it was a lot of fun because you got to do a lot of like what if kinds of stories with it. But in terms of continuity and everything, like, it's one of those things where you can have a lot of fun and then it never really, pushes the story forward, which I think that can be a good thing. Like I said, I think the biggest, hurdle for me is the fact that I feel like I had to read all these tie-ins to also kind of get an understanding, appreciation of what was happening throughout the story as well, too. And that's, I think, again, that's an X-Men thing that I'm hoping Marvel at some point will start tying it in a little bit tighter and not expect that any time, because the current Krakoan thing has been like 5 years in the making. So it's like, that's a lot of time investment for somebody if they want to really follow along the story to be able to really enjoy it. Now, this one is a lot different, as you said, because this is more like a 4-month event. But the Krakoan one that we currently have, this has been almost 5 years now. And I'm just like, I like it. I really enjoy it, but I also want to be able to say like, maybe 3 series tops that I can read and follow along. I don't want to have to, put in 10 or 12 different series on my pull list just to be able to enjoy a major event that's happening. So, yeah, I think that's been my biggest hurdle with this series by far. So
no, that's completely understandable too. Cause like I say, I just think they're just, the current run of Krakoa, I think they're recycling a lot that we've seen in the past from the X-Men. And I think doing those big crossovers, maybe there are a lot of people that like them. Like me personally, I don't, because it's just a lot at once. And I think you take a look at the most recently, X of Swords.
Yes.
and that was just like the never ending story. And I was just like, okay, I'm out. Like, I can't finish this. I'll catch up with it when it's after. So I think that's just a deterrent. And I hope just like in the future, like you can tell a great story in smaller pieces. Instead of just making everybody go out and get all the side stories too. Because like at the heart of the matter, it should just be the main points. And then if something good spirals out of it, then you can do one shots or limited series after.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, hopefully, with the current runs, they'll start tying in. And I think it sounds like they might be doing that with the Fall of X that's coming up, hopefully, but we'll see. So yeah, but I understand, like there's some series that's currently going on that I absolutely love. And there's some that, just like you said, with X of Swords, it sounds really fascinating and everything, but it's again, how many teams and stories do we need to read just to be like, what is going on in Krakoa right now? So yeah. Okay, so going back to Age of Apocalypse, Matt Myers, our editor-in-chief at Comic Watch, said every one of the creative teams was clearly inspired and let rip with some of the tightest and boldest writing of their careers for the entire decade. And considering how fallow most of Marvel was in 1994 creatively, it was a shockingly focused next-level read that feels ahead of its time. Ross Hutchinson said, it still cracks me up that the creative team at Marvel had no clue if it would work, and everyone was exceptionally nervous about it. It was revolutionary and exceptionally bold in its ambition, and every AU event, and to this day, and including SOS right now, is held up against for it in comparison. So that's from Comic Watch. Illumina Casters, the only comment that we got, again, because I put it out there, I think late last night, and this weekend is being Easter weekend, all that, everyone's been busy and everything, but Joe Loves Comics said he's never read it, but it's supposed to be a classic, which again, we've been talking about how much, we've heard Age of Apocalypse being a a classic. And then on Twitter, can you actually tag this person, the Contrarians at
Julio
Contrarian Prime?
Yes. Shout out to Julio. Fantastic
Yes.
podcast too, by the way. Contrarians. Everybody should go check out.
Definitely. This person originally retweeted the tweet and said, will the episode be 5 hours long in order to do it justice? We're at like an hour long, so it might be 5 hours by the time we're done. Not really, but I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, and I feel like we still haven't done it justice in terms of unpacking, because I feel like there's still a lot of details that it makes it interesting that we could have touched on. Yeah. That we could just go in that rabbit hole, by far. But after he said that, he said, my favorite X-Men event, epic, ambitious, with great alternate takes on so many characters, and an ending that delivered on that 4-month buildup. I just bought the omnibus and can't wait to reread it. And then Bizarro Fett said that is his favorite X-Men event ever. So a lot of people enjoyed this event. Like, this is really a really pivotal one for a lot of people. Short box summary at PurpleBird616 said, absolutely love this event. I think the editorial and shipping was brilliant and brave. The Legion quest lead in was epic as hell. And hunting down the back issues are some of my fondest memories in high school. And then none of my friends like comics podcast at No Comic Friends says one of the greatest event comics of all time. So thank you everybody who shared their thoughts about this comic event. Really appreciate it. It's really cool to see what people thinks about these series, especially if it's one that you're not a fan of. So I always love to hear what people enjoy about it, but I love to hear what people didn't enjoy about it, because again, not every story or event's going to be for everybody. I think, Ken, you absolutely love this. I enjoyed it. I don't think it's something that I absolutely love. I think there's just, again, like by the end of the day, I'm like, I don't think I'm going to go out and get the omnibus necessarily. I might go back and read some of the other side stories that you and I had talked about offline, but it's one of those things was like, I think, as what we mentioned with a lot of things, put in context with what was happening in 1994 and everything like that, I think has a lot more greater meaning than somebody who's going back almost 30 years later to read this story and be like, what the hell is going on with some of this stuff. So, but yeah, I love hearing people's thoughts about it, how much they loved it, how much they didn't enjoy it. So, Ken, your favorite key moment in this series or arc, like, was one of the things he absolutely loved about this whole story run with the 10 issues that we covered in this episode?
To be honest with you, I love the entire Astonishing X-Men series, the four there. That's why I brought it up to you, especially because I think Scott Lobdell's art writing and Joey Mad's art, and especially with the creativity flip that they did. You had a sympathetic Sabretooth, which we've never seen, where he had Wild Child as, his Robin, so to speak. And turned out to, usually Wild Child had always been a throwaway character from Alpha Flight. And now you see just like how that, they're working together, and how Sabretooth is just completely 180'd. You had Blink, who at the time was supposed to be part of the original Generation X series, but she was killed off during the crossover that led into it. So a lot of fans were waiting to see how she was going to play, and their bond happening together. Plus the creative flip of Sunfire and his costume. We had Morph. And just this dynamic where you throw everybody together, and it's just like, this is what this series is all about for Age of Apocalypse. Like I said, you can dive into like the Summers Brothers with Factor X. Generation Next is awesome for like the just insanity that is going on there, that was probably my second favorite one. And then just, like I say, depending on what your fandom is, for all the Gambit fans, they, checked out the series that was for Replacing X-Force and Weapon X too. But for me, it was like that moment where you saw the X-Men completely 180'd, and it still had the heart, the emotion. So by the time you got to that 4th issue and you see Rogue declare like the Age of Apocalypse is no more, and the group shot, you're like, let's go. I still even get fired up about it to this day. That's just how much I love about it. Because, like I say, when you grow up reading the X-Men, and especially when they were, the big thing at Marvel, and, they did no wrong, and, they get the spotlight on them. And then to see them just completely just say, like, let's just go completely the other direction and let's see what goes. And you still capture that moment that reminds you, like, why you love the X-Men. Just amazing, top to bottom.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting because you covered a lot of actually what were some of my key and favorite moments in the series. And one of them being that I absolutely love seeing Sabretooth as more of a empathetic person that's on, the team of the X-Men, because, his whole mentality and viewpoint pretty much is different in this reality than what we've seen in the main 616. And the fact that he is it was really interesting because in Astonishing X-Men, you see that him and Wolverine were actually, they seemed like they were friends, which, I mean, I know in the story, they, in some realities or some storylines, they were in the past before they split and all that. But in this one, it was really nice to see them kind of being friendly again, but that Victor is the person that finds Blink at a young age and becomes that father figure. And they have that huge, very loving, strong parental bond. And that Blink would do anything to save and protect Victor Cree, the man who saved her, and vice versa with him. Like, he would do anything to protect her. And so you see that story play out in the entire, story arc of Age of Apocalypse. I absolutely love that. I think that was, one of my favorite relationships in this, that I really wish if there's anything that came out of this event that kept in continuity, it would be this one, because I just absolutely love this relationship. And I think we need to see more of those kinds of relationships. Not that we don't see those things. Like, X-Men is one of those stories where it's like how you, find your family outside of your, biological family in a sense. Right. And so this is definitely one of those things. But I think, kind of highlighting that in this way was just fantastic. I absolutely love seeing that. And I agree, Iceman and Morph were also some of my favorite characters, especially, you said you love Iceman. Iceman is not my favorite character, but I will say it's my favorite unappreciated character, because I feel like he is definitely a character that you can have a lot of fun with, but doesn't get a lot of attention for a lot of series and as much as other people or other characters. In this story, I feel like he gets a lot of attention. His costume in Legion Quest was really cool, and his character development and his appearances in this story I absolutely love. And Morph was fantastic as well. He was definitely a comic relief in this story. Yep. They had a lot of fun, not just him being comical, but using him in pivotal times that kind of change. It's like a crazy reveal that happened that you think is this one person. It turns out it's Morph this whole time, doing that thing or whatever. And then there was another one where Rogue absorbs Morph's power, and then she uses Morph's power to change it to somebody else. And so she's pulling a Morph, but it's Rogue doing it this time. I love how they use Morph in this, because it was multifaceted in that it was very comical, but very practical and very strategic in how they would fight as X-Men using those powers.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. So those are our key favorite moments. Let's end it with, what is something that we wish would be different about this series?
A lot less crossovers.
Yeah.
Like, to be honest with you, the Excalibur series just didn't do anything for me. It just didn't really connect there. Gambit's story with the Externals could have been wrapped up a lot quicker. I thought it was just kind of giving him a spotlight at the time, and that is. And then, I mean, Weapon X was cool to see, but I don't think we needed an entire series based around Wolverine and Jean Grey at that time. I think it was a cool moment to see, but I just think for the overall factor of the story, if they tightened a lot of it up and just really, even if they did 4 issues the size of Alpha and Omega and just did that, I think that would have been a lot more. But I understand why they did it, because you're replacing your monthly title, so you want to do something great. But I think it's when you look at the overall pictures, there's ups and downs. Like I say, you can hear when I talk about Astonishing X-Men and Generation Next. Like I said, that's my favorite. And then you get to the other stuff, and it's okay. And then Factor X was cool in concepts, but it just didn't I like it, but then I also look at the different things. It's for Havoc, I thought there was a standout moment for him, but he still was whiny and annoying, and just it played into. So when you have that big moment in Omega, you're finally. So I think if they tighten it up, but this is something I think they just tried experimenting with, and maybe the length of it too, because we touched upon, it went for 5 months essentially. So that's almost half a calendar year. That's a lot to do, that if you're not having everybody buying all these books, you get to Omega, and some people are going to check it out because they've been following one story, but you're not going to have that big payoff unless you read everything. And then, because when you have like the big battles like Magneto and Apocalypse and how brutal that was, you're not going to have the same reaction as when you have Havoc, Jean Grey, Wolverine.
Mm-hmm.
Just it doesn't play out that way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And I gotta say for me in this area, I don't think there's anything that I haven't touched on that is new. But I mean, just like what you said here, for me, it's just the tie-ins in general. Just it makes it hard for somebody if they want to get into this storyline. They got to do a better job of like how to tie it in. Mm-hmm. That if somebody comes back and wants to read it, like how would they do this, or kind of create a reading guide, which they could definitely do in if you use Marvel Unlimited. But if you're somebody that don't have Marvel Unlimited, or using library, or if you're getting like the physical copies or something like that, it's a little bit difficult because you don't know like where to kind of fall in. Sometimes some of these things happen at the same time, but it's just it can be daunting. I mean, it's just like, it's just one event. Yeah. So it's almost like the opposite effect of Devil's Reign that I've been hearing people say, that, Devil's Reigns probably didn't need to be its event that crossed over into all these properties. But it seems like it's kind of the opposite effect of what you're saying, is that, we probably didn't need to have all these tie-ins to the story. Yeah. So that I still think it's a weird thing that they had Legion try to seduce his mother. I don't know. Like, that was just a weird thing. Like, I'm sorry, I can't. That's like the one thing I can get. Even I don't care if it was the 90s. It was like not as faux pas. Like, it's still weird. Like, I think I was just thought it was a multiple personality like took over and didn't make the connection. Like, that's just how I kind of just ran with it. I was like, all right, well, still it's awkward. It's weird. All right, let's just turn the page and go. It's reasons. like I don't want to I know I'm right there with you. Like, the setup for it, like they had the potential, but it's like to get from point A to point B, it's like it went in so many different turns. Like I say, their entire time the X-Men had memory loss down in Egypt there. I believe it's like you guys could have sped that up a little quicker. Like, it didn't need to be 4 issues going back and forth. Like, it could literally have been 2 and been done. I know. It was just it's just, I mean, and I get like some things you have to like, some things were like kind of interesting, all that. It's just this one, it's like, I don't know who thought I'm always interested to kind of find out, like, in the writing room, who like pitched this idea, and then who are the other people like, oh my gosh, that's a great idea, let's do that, like, because it's never like one person that like it's left unchecked. It's like multiple people see this, and maybe there are multiple people that are just like, no, I don't think that's a good idea for a number of reasons, but they end up like approving it anyways for whatever reason. Because again, like you said, reasons, right? But it's just odd that this was even on the table to begin with. It's like, why did he have to do that in order for this to happen? Like it's just weird. I think that's my biggest hang up. Like, there's a lot of like little hang ups, but that one, I'm just like, what the hell?
But if you ever read anything with Legion, it's no matter what it is, it's
weird. Yeah.
Like I say, the TV show is prime example.
Yeah.
Like, I love the show, but I would sit there after and go like, what did I just watch for 45 minutes? And like, I'd literally be sitting there like staring at like the next show and just like trying to process, like, what did I see? Like, I love the first 2 seasons. Third one, not so much for me. But I was just like, this is Legion, because I'm like, I have no idea what I watched.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's something.
It's it's one, I gotta say, like, after reading this, like, I definitely want to watch the show again. Like, I think I've only watched maybe half of the first season, and same thing what you said. At that time, I didn't know anything about Legion, so I didn't know the backstory behind this character or anything. So when I was watching it, I was doubly what the hell is going on and what I'm watching here, because I had no idea, the story behind it. Now that I'm learning a little bit more about it, and I had watched it originally before I got back into comics, and so now that I'm learning a little bit more about it, I'm just like, okay, I think I can probably catch a little bit more with it now. So, okay, so that was Age of Apocalypse. And so at the end of every episode, we like to talk about what comics we're currently reading. So I'm going to share what people have sent in to let us know what they're reading. And then we'll go into what you and I are reading, Ken. So from Comic Watch, B-Rat said that they're currently reading the end of the Levitz Giffen LOSH Baxter run, which I got to say, I don't know what LOSH is.
League of Superheroes.
League of Superheroes. Thank you. Gotcha. So sometimes with the acronyms, like there's some
Yeah.
acronyms I definitely know, there's some I don't, and that
Yeah,
was one of them.
Losh threw me off for a while too, but then I'm like, oh yeah, it's Legion.
Yeah. That slowly builds to the 5 years later era, as well as the Legion 89 book that would star Brainiac, to Lobo, which he said gross, plus the rest of the League of Superheroes related titles like Valor, Timberwolf, Legionnaires, etc., and simply a masterpiece. And he says this as he's finishing up issue 50 of the Baxter series. Giffen's debuted his new style in his book, going in a way that's quite different from previous style that's heavily influenced by Jim Starlin that would leave fans of two minds. They either loved it or hated it. Anyway, you can see how much he's grown here, developing his writing style that would make him one of the most prolific writers of the post-crisis era of DC Comics. On Twitter, at Blaine McGaff said, honestly loving Adventures of Superman John Kent. It's a multiversal story that goes back to his time in captivity with Ultraman and is leading to a crossover with Injustice Universe I haven't read, but excited about learning. And then Mickey Joe Smith, who's also known as Cell Phone Wall Keys, is reading Rogue and Gambit #1. The art is great. It's a Rogue and Gambit story, so it has a built-in love to it already. But it's a fun addition to their story. It feels like those movies with a couple on the run, like Bonnie and Clyde are true romance, but they're good guys. And then last but not least, at Pop Cult Prod, which their account name is actually, I think, Pop Culture Production. Going back to the start of Hellblazer, it does show its age a bit, however, still a fantastic read. Dark horror with a bleak, dark mirror held up to the world. Constantine is at his shittiest best in this story. Ken, of all those that I just shared, is there any of these that kind of like stand out to you of like what was really interesting or exciting to you?
Rogue and Gambit, love it. Stephanie Phillips, one of my favorite writers.
Yeah.
Absolutely crushing it. Grimm by Boom Studios should be in everybody's pull list. I'm just putting that out there. The coolest book on the shelves, bar none. Just, it's a vibe. It's a whole energy. It's a fantastic. And Adventures of Superman too. Like I say, the Tom Taylor stuff, I'm interested. Like for me, like Superman has always been a tough read because it's like he doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't have a really great rogues gallery. So when he's challenged and it's presented in a different light, I think that it proves really for some great stories. And I think what Tom Taylor's been doing, Jonathan Kent's there. I think the Joshua Williamson run right now has been awesome. I know we're just a couple issues in, but still. But yeah, the Adventures of Superman and like I said, Rogue and Gambit. That's my
I loved Superman Adventures of John Kent. I haven't started the new Superman series yet, but Rogue and Gambit #1 I've read and I absolutely love it. I've never read a Rogue and Gambit solo series from either character, but I absolutely love this one. And it still kind of fits in the current X-Men run, but I feel like you can read this and kind of enjoy and understand what's going on because it's almost like a self-contained story, even though they're hinting at like what's going on in the larger story. They do a pretty good job of explaining, that to the reader if you're not familiar with it at all whatsoever. But like you said, Stephanie Phillips, I don't think I've read anything of hers that I didn't enjoy. Everything that she has written so far has just been phenomenal. And I think this is definitely one of those that will continue to be a really good story. So,
yeah.
All right. So Ken, what are you currently reading this week for the week of April 10th?
Catching up on Radiant Black, the franchise book of comics' most exciting line, the Massive Verse. Kyle Higgins and the team over there is absolutely crushing it. Michael Basidal is editing and overseeing this whole thing. It's a movement, and with everything going on with them, Supermassive 2 is just around the corner. Yes. Catalyst War is coming. No One, which, I mean, how amazing is that book?
I absolutely love that. I'm glad you suggest that to me because I think not only is it a great comic story, but he is trying to do something different as an experience, basically, right? And that's what No One's doing, because not only is there a comic book story, but there's a podcast that goes with it that gives you even more story behind what you're reading. And he's just what Kyle Higgins has been doing with Massiverse is he's trying to do a lot of different things with the comic book medium. I think it's been doing phenomenal, and it's just been doing outstanding in terms of the things he's attempting to do. And I think they've been landing really well and they make a lot of sense. And it's getting people to, talk about and enjoy it as well too. And so it's just story-wise, I haven't been able to read any of the other Massiverse, but no one I absolutely been loving for a number of reasons. And so it's all this stuff has been fantastic so far that I've heard, but no one is definitely one that is really, it's on my pull list to get every week. And I think the second issue I think comes out not this week, but the following week. So I'm really looking forward to that.
I can't wait to check that out.
Yeah. So and as you know, C2E2 they announced the Catalyst War that's going to be coming out as a major event with Radiant Black and a couple of the other properties from the Massiverse as well too. So that's going to be a really fun one to see happening over the summer as well.
Yeah. No, I can't wait. I can't rave about that line enough. I think that they always remind me of when Image first came out and just that buzz from the original 7, because when you'd walk into a comic shop, everybody was like, yo, did you check this book out? Did you get this? You get this? And like, I go into comic shops now and literally that's what happens when a Massiverse book comes out. No lie. Like people just literally run up and like, did you read Dead Lucky? You need to go buy it. And I'll read it. Yeah. And just like Rogue Son, oh my God. And it's just a rave about it. And if you go into it, I mean, the creativity, the production, the whole package, it's just it just reminds me of that era. And I'm like, this is why you become comic fans and you get hooked into like superhero books.
Yeah.
So
it's definitely one where if you like superheroes, but you want to read something that is not from DC or Marvel, this is a great one because they've been doing a fantastic job of writing superhero stories that's very different, that still intersect with one another, but are still self-contained stories. So it's not like an X-Men event where you have to read everything to know what's been going on in these things. And Kyle Higgins specifically said that for the Catalyst War, they're writing in a way where you don't have to read the other books. I think if you read the other books, like you appreciate a little bit more, but you don't have to in order to follow along what's going on with this. And so I think that's really, if you're looking for something new and different, but still in the superhero world of things, this is definitely the one I would recommend that's out right now, is that whole Massiverse, like any of them. Again, even though I haven't read, Radiant Black, I've heard nothing but great things about that and Radiant Pink and everything.
Awesome.
No One, definitely get No One, because I think No One is really, really, really well done. And I think it's just going to be something that a lot of people are going to be talking about for years to come in terms of a comic book series that really does something different and interesting that's just so well done as a story, but also, pushes the limits on how to experience and to consume a story beyond just reading a comic book issue too. For me, if you've been listening to the last 4 episodes, you'll know that I've been saying I'm going to start X-Men Red. I have not started it yet. I'm planning on starting it. It's on my list. I just, I have this whole bag of issues that I have not read yet, and X-Men Red is in here. Actually, it's not in here. So this is even without X-Men Red. I have a bunch of issues that I need to get through because, again, I've been traveling. I've been sick, so I haven't been able to read this stuff. So once I get caught up on that, I'm going to read X-Men Red. This week, Storm and Brotherhood of Mutants, the next issue is coming out. So I'm definitely getting that one because I've been investing in that. Another book that I'm going to read that I'm really looking forward to is The Batman Who Laughs, because I have never actually read this story. I've only seen this character, but don't know anything about it. And I've heard a lot of people say that this is great. It's from Scott Snyder, and the artist is Jock. And over at C2E2, thanks to Michael Rothman from Nerd Initiative, he was able to let me go into the VIP to meet with Scott. And he actually signed it. And Michael got this book for me as well, too. So now that he's got this signed, I'm going to read it and, definitely just sit down and be able to learn more about this character that a lot of people really enjoy. I have no idea what this character is all about, other than it's a Joker posing as a weird Batman thing.
It's basically a great character. I can't stand the name though. They have to come up with something else for it. It's just like, no, it's just too long.
It doesn't roll off the tongue very well.
No, because reasons. But yeah, let me know what you think of that though. Definitely, we got to talk about that.
I will definitely do that. Yeah. So, well, that is the end of this episode. So, Ken, thank you very much for coming on the show. Before I let you go, let us know where we can find you and your show online.
Very simple. You want to find out everything going on with the ODPH, and I hope you do, swing on over to ODPHpodcast.com. Social media links are all right there. Parlay Point's blog section is always getting updated. The directory. So if you're trying to figure out where to listen to the ODPH on your favorite podcast player, boom, is right there. So click that follow, click that subscribe, drop a 5-star review. It always helps the algorithm. And you can also check me out on Nerd Initiative, dropping some comic reviews there on New Comic Book Days, Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And Sean, thank you for having me on, man. This has been a blast.
Oh, thank you. I'm always loving talking about comics with you, so you're always welcome to come back on the show. Thank you very much again for talking about Age of Apocalypse. This is very fascinating, and I hope to have you on a future episode of The Caption Life. Thank you. And that wraps up another episode of The Caption Life. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. You can follow us on social media at Caption Life. For more information about us and all of our previous episodes, visit thecaptionlife.com.